John is going to come up and he's going to introduce Jennifer, but before John makes his remarks, we have a video, and this is actually Jennifer's video, and it was so good, I said, well, we just have to play it. It's a little out of order, so let's hope it works.
Me again. I had the pleasure on September 19th last year, I was part of the Tea Party Patriots put on a rally on Capitol Hill where we had Mark Levin. I don't know if you remember that meeting where we talked about it. It's truly amazing. Now, one of the speakers there was Jennifer Zeng, who's going to be our speaker tonight. And she's the author of a book called Witnessing History. And it talked of, I don't want to steal her thunder, but at that rally, she talked about the excruciating torture she was put under just because she didn't believe in sync with the Chinese Communist Party. So imagine 400 people, including Mark Levin, our mouths were agape. Because it's different when you see it on television and then when you actually hear it in person, that somebody this courageous, this fearless, is actually in front of you, telling you about these things you only see on the internet. She made it real, and it was unbelievably overwhelming, and I think, my God, we got to get her to the Redlands Tea Party so we can bring this issue directly to you to show you how real, right? So when we listen to Jennifer tonight, think of Bernie Sanders and his buddies, right? Because that's where they want to take this. I know it sounds far-fetched, but it's not. Because when you lead the underlying people who support Bernie Sanders et al., they're pushing for the same thing inevitably that Greg had on the slides and what Jennifer warns us about in China. So I do not want to steal her thunder. I'm going to let Jennifer tell her story. So please come on up, Jennifer. Well, thank you. Again, we were so stunned to hear her on Capitol Hill. And Jennifer, thank you for coming out here and just deliver to the audience. I mean, you have your speech, but what you told us on Capitol Hill, I mean, I was just going like, my God. You know, I mean, I was in Iraq, Afghanistan. I had some of the locals tell us those personal stories, and that's what makes it real. So I want to thank you very much for coming to Redlands.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Before I begin my speech, I'd like first to mention there's a little table over there. I have my books, only 2 copies left, and 3 copies of my DVD, and a few handouts and a sign-up page. I'm a speaker of the we had an anti-communism action team in Washington, D.C. So I'm a speaker of that bureau. So if you sign up your email and name there, you can receive we have I think weekly newsletter about what this group is doing and some relative news. So it's there. And then I'll begin my speech. So first of all, thank you for giving me this opportunity to share my experiences of growing up and living in communist China, which is referred to as socialism with Chinese characteristics. The system almost killed me before I was able to escape. So I do not want to live in any kind of socialism again. But here in the US, I'm starting to feel like it has followed me. Not only many politicians are making socialism sound so sweet, but many young Americans also feel attracted by it. But here is what it really is. In communist China, the government, or rather, the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, controls everything. Because it controls everything, it can make all the rules, take away people's liberty, property, and dignity, and persecute them at will. Ever since the CCP took power 70 years ago, more than half of the population has been persecuted one way or the other. More than 80 million people died of unnatural deaths, and that number has not included those 300 to 400 million unborn babies who were killed by this one-child family planning policy. So my family and I suffered too, and here is some of what I experienced. I'll start in the middle of night at 2 a.m. on April 13th, 2000. I suddenly heard loud bangs on the door of my house. Boom, boom, boom. Before I had time to figure out what had happened, a vicious-looking policeman was already in my room. He grabbed me with force and took me to the police station. Later, I asked, why? Why was I arrested while asleep at my own home? And you guess what's the answer? He said, because of your thoughts. So without any trial, I was sent to a labor camp. I still remember the big sign of Beijing female labor camp. It was like entering right into hell. From the very first moment, we were forced to squat motionlessly under the baking sun. I tell you like what? So we had to put our hands behind our heads and lowering our heads and looking down at our feet, squat motionlessly under the sun for 15 hours. So whenever somebody couldn't endure it and fainted away, electric batons were immediately applied on her so that she could be awakened and then continue to squat motionlessly. On the second day, 2 police guards dragged me from the cell to the courtyard, threw me on the ground, and applied electric batons all over my body until I lost consciousness. The torture that I suffered and witnessed was terrifying. A young woman was tied to a chair. Several male police guards used electric batons to shock her head and her private part until she lost control of her bowel movement. As a result, she couldn't walk for several months. Another method they used to torture females was to tie 2 toothbrushes together with the sharp end facing outside. Then they push this thing into females' vaginas and twisted until the soul blood came out. And the guards would also throw females naked into male prisoners' cells to have them gang raped repeatedly. And here I'll pause for a minute to explain why and how I ended up in this kind of situation. Back in 1987, when I was 21 years old, and I was a student at Peking University or Beijing University. That was one of the top universities in China. At that time, I believed that the Chinese Communist Party was the savior of China and the only force that could create a new and better China. The party was forever glorious, correct, and correct. I believed it all because that was I and everyone around me had been taught ever since I was born. So I applied to join the party and was accepted. And I had always been very obedient and doing very well with my study. And in 1992, my daughter was born. I remember holding her in my arms and marveling at her beauty and perfection. It was the happiest moment in my life. But soon after that, I became pregnant again. And then, for the first time in my life, I met the other side of the party. In communist China, no one was allowed to have 2 children then. So I was forced to do abortion and to end my pregnancy. I didn't want to, but I had no choice. And since then, my health was totally ruined. I lied in bed without being able to work, without being able to look after my child. And my life only had a new start in 1997. I remember the July 2nd of that year was a day I will never forget. On that day, I received a set of Falun Gong books posted to Beijing from my sister in my hometown. So the books answered all my questions toward human life and inspired me so much so that I decided to practice Falun Gong right away. Falun Gong basically involves living by 3 principles: truthfulness, compassion, and tolerance or forbearance. So in your daily life, you follow the 3 principles and plus doing 5 sets of gentle exercises, including meditation. So after practicing Falun Gong for only 1 month, I found my previous health problems all gone. I was full of energy, full of vitality and happiness. I had finally found the purpose of my life. I felt like a new person being reborn. So because of its very obvious health and mental benefits, Falun Gong spread very fast in China. So within 7 years since its first introduction to the public in 1992, so it was estimated that there were 70 to 100 million people in China were practicing Falun Gong in 1999. And then at this stage, one day, things suddenly changed. The communist Chinese regime could never accept the fact that people were believing in truth, compassion, and tolerance instead of the party. So on July 20th, 1999, the Communist Party started the overwhelming persecution of Falun Gong. People have been mass arrested, beaten, tortured, murdered, killed on demand for their organs, and thrown into camps without trial. I couldn't believe it was happening. I couldn't believe the always great, always glorious, always correct party could do something this evil. Nor could I believe that I personally would also become a target, simply because I went to the park to practice meditation and because I lived by truth, compassion, and tolerance. Then on April 13th, 2000 at 2 a.m. The police came for me too. Maybe you are wondering why and how can this be happening in this day and time? How can such a cruel regime be allowed to persecute good citizens? Why hasn't anyone done something about it? The answer, like in all cases of cruel totalitarian regimes in history that wanted to legitimize the persecution of ordinary citizens, is propaganda. So ever since the persecution began, all media outlets in China, including TV, radio, newspapers, were all utilized to demonize Falun Gong and its practitioners. Hundreds of thousands of false reports bombarded the public 24/7. It was said that we would cut open our own belly, get up in the middle of night, and murder children or even eat our babies. Every lie told in history about a persecuted group became a false news report on Falun Gong. And the worst moment for me within this propaganda storm was when my daughter, my 7-year-old daughter, screamed at me. I know Mom is a good person, but the TV says Falun Gong practitioners are bad. I don't know who to believe. It almost broke my heart to see such a small child had to make a choice between her own mother and the whole propaganda machinery of this state. And her innocent eyes were full of anger, bewilderment, and demanding for an answer that I really couldn't offer. So let's go back to the camp. After trying to withstand all the unimaginably cruel torture, both physically and mentally, for more than 6 months, I finally collapsed. I broke down, and I signed a statement to guarantee that I would give up my Falun Gong. And another reason is because after I witnessed so much, I experienced so much, on the first day I felt, is this 21st century in so-called New China? Had I been sent back to the Nazi concentration camps that we read about in history? I really couldn't believe this could be happening on such day and such a time. So somehow I felt a very strong impulse to write a book to document all these anti-humanity crimes that I experienced, I saw with my own eyes. I think the world needs to know. And somehow I felt it was my historic mission to write it down and to leave it to the human history so our future generations could learn what's really happened during that time in human history. But so signing a guarantee to give up what I had believed for 2 years and practiced and has also become part of my life, it felt like killing myself. That was really the worst moment of my life, with all my thoughts being ripped and then taken away. I felt like becoming an empty shell in a human form, but a non-human being, without thoughts, soul, and a free will or human dignity. And worse still, I was forced to help the police to torture others I can never forget a teenage girl who was sent to the camp one day before I was to be released. I had to watch over her to make sure that she didn't fall asleep, as sleep deprivation was one of the main forms of torture. And by the way, I witnessed with my own eyes the very moment of one young woman who was driven into insanity because of the sleep deprivation. 1 minute ago, she was still herself, but 1 minute later, because she wasn't given any sleep for 4 nights and 5 days and under constantly torture, so she became insane. And that kind of thing happened in the labor camp all the time. And the longest record I knew was kept by a woman now living in New York City. Her name is Zhang Yijie. She was not allowed to sleep continuously for 42 days and 42 nights. That kind of crime and that kind of torture was more than enough to break down any living human being. So while I was watching that young girl, teenage girl in the camp, I had so much sympathy for her, since I knew too well what she would have to go through. Yet I couldn't show any of my sympathy. So after accomplishing this final task in another sleepless night, I was finally released in the morning. But I didn't feel happy at all, because what's the point of me being released while all the others were still there and suffering all this? But you know what? I was not taken to home upon release. Instead, I was taken to the police station, and the police told me I had the obligation to go to their brainwashing centers to continue to help the police, to help those held in the brainwashing centers, because there were not enough space in the labor camp. So they set up many brainwashing centers in schools, in any public facility, to be used as an example of reform, to continue to live as a non-human being, an empty shell, and continue to help the police. I felt I would rather die. So after 1 year of separation from my family, also I longed to be with my family so much. I escaped only 5 days of my release, so that I could avoid doing the things they want me to do. And in that case, I was more fortunate than many of my fellow Chinese citizens and fellow Falun Gong practitioners. I escaped to the west, to Australia, to seek asylum. And very slowly and gradually, I tried to gain back my thoughts, my soul, my free will, my dignity. It was a very long and difficult process. I had to overcome so many mental barriers and emotions, such as a sense of not being worthy, regrets, remorse, humiliation, shame, and disgrace. I think ultimately the determination to expose the evil and help others enabled me to stand on my feet again as a complete human being, capable of thoughts and actions again. That's how I finished writing my book, Witnessing History, One Woman's Fight for Freedom and Falun Gong, to tell my story, and became the main character of the award-winning documentary, Free China, The Courage to Believe. So now let's talk a little bit more about the forced organ harvesting I mentioned earlier. When I was in the camp, my fellow Falun Gong practitioners and I were also subjected to physical examinations and blood tests apart from physical torture and endless hard labor. So the purpose of the blood test and physical examination is to store our data of our blood and tissue types in the computer system so that whenever someone was in need of an organ, the person who was a match could be killed on demand so that his or her organs could be sold for organ transplant. Only several days ago, on March the 1st and February 29th, the Chinese official media reported 2 successful lung transplant to the coronavirus patient. And you guess what? They only decided to do the transplant on 24th when they found that the patient's lung was damaged beyond irrecoverable damage. So they decided to do a transplant on 24th, and they were able to find double lung for this patient 4 days later on 24th, and they finished the transplant on 29th. So in all the world, in United States, we have a very complete and established system of organ donation, but you have to wait for years to find a match. But they can find a match within 4 days. That's the secret, because they did mass blood and DNA tests to hundreds of thousands of people. So they have their database there. So they do reverse match. They find a match to reverse you, not like here, we wait for somebody, a donor that can match us. So in the past 20 plus years, it was not a plot in a horror movie or Hollywood movie, but real and heinous crime perpetrated against innocent people. So during the past 20 years or so of the persecution of Falun Gong, the number of people killed for their organs could be millions. So right now, we are seeing another CCP-made disaster spreading in the world like wildfire, the coronavirus pandemic, because the CCP's systematic suppressing of information and truth, as well as its fundamental mentality of having no respect at all for human life. The CCP had been mishandling the situation from the very beginning. It not only covered up the truth, but also arrested doctors who tried to own the public. As a result, the virus got out of control and has now so far spread to over 80 countries. I think California just announced an emergency state yesterday. And because of the cover-ups on top of cover-ups, China not only had lost the opportunities to contain it, but has also seen heavy human life losses. People who died or who have been infected could be hundreds of thousands. So now experts are predicting coronavirus could infect 40 to 70% of the global population. And if the death rate for the symptomatic is 1 to 3%, then the total fatalities worldwide for coronavirus could be between 10 million to 100 million, and between 400,000 and 5 million in the United States. So this is scary enough. And this is just the latest disaster brought upon human beings by the CCP. These, dear ladies and gentlemen, are the realities of socialism in practice. Socialists promise you heaven on earth, but always end up giving you a one-way ticket to hell. They make socialism sound so sweet, but real socialism is torturing people, both their bodies and their minds. Real socialism is killing people for their organs, for profit. Real socialism is victimizing half the population. Real socialism is constant propaganda and lies and cover-ups. Real socialism is punishing people for their thoughts. And worst of all, real socialism is turning human beings into non-persons with no free will or dignity. The promises of socialism are alluring, yes, but the realities are harsh and unlivable. I think it is now high time for the world to wake up to the false allure of communism. It's more fatal than the virus. If we don't fight against, contain, and eliminate it, we are doomed. Thank you so much. Yes, just very quickly. I mentioned about the anti-communist action team in Washington. So if you could remember, sign up your email address and name so they can receive the weekly email updates of what's happening. So next. So this is the movie I mentioned which featured my story, the Free China, the Courage to Believe. So I have 3 copies left. So this is just a picture before the crackdown of Falun Gong. So you can see how popular it was back then. It was just a very common thing. Before 1999, very many people are practicing this peaceful practice, meditating on any public places in the morning. So these are some of the photos of real people being tortured very badly. Some of them were starved to death and tortured to death. So there's just some. So this lady, you see her face, that was left by electric batons, and she was later tortured to death. A young lady, 36 years old. So that's what was maybe the only photo we can get, because after she was tortured to death, she was sent to the hospital. So some local fellow Falun Gong practitioners sneak into that hospital, took those photos. Otherwise, if she was still in the labor camp, we would never have this kind of evidence of how bad the torture could be. So these are all some of the other torture methods they use to torture practitioners inside prison or labor camps. So these are all demonstrations by Falun Gong practitioners who were released to demonstrate what they really suffered in the camp. So out of imagination, and all these are real photos of real cases of people being tortured. You see the body of the chest of that practitioner, and I think his name is Wang Bing, got cut up, and onto the left collar, that a teacher of university in Beijing, she was tortured to death. So thousands upon thousands of people have already been tortured to the death and leave their babies behind. So this is a real photo taken in the Masanja labor camp of people being tortured and beaten up. So how can I show video? So this is a very real video we could gain of a Falun Gong practitioner. Now he lives in San Francisco. Now he managed to take some, photos, videos inside the camp. It's not play. It's not in the video. Oh, okay. Oh, this is picture. So this, they tortured. That's during the Beijing Olympic. So sorry, I couldn't show the video. So let's just give you a rough idea of some visual idea of what the persecution really happened inside the labor camps. That's, I think, very few cases we can get, and there are thousands and millions other cases that we don't have any photos, but you can just give you a rough idea. So that's the reality of socialist China, of socialism with Chinese characteristics. Thank you again for your opportunity.
Can you answer some questions? So tell us, if you bought a sweater made in China, if you bought a sweater made in China, tell us, you may have made it, or your fellow prisoners may have made it.
Yes, I didn't have a chance to talk about the products we made in the camp. So the camp was called Forced or Re-Education through Forced Labor Camps. So to force us to do hard labor is just an everyday life of the labor camp. So for me, we were, I think, forced to make many hand-knitting sweaters and cushions, hats, all those very cheap products. In one occasion, I remember it's February 2000, the labor camp got an order from Nestle. That's a very famous company headquartered in Swiss, made coffee. So we made 100,000 promotional rabbits for Nestle. So it needs at least 10 hours, 30 procedures to make one piece. And the labor camp only received 4 cents of each. I don't know how much it was when it was sold, and we obviously got nothing. So when I was in the camp, for the most part of time, we were knitting sweaters. So sometimes when people ask me, do you miss your family in the camp? I said no, honestly no. Because when I was in the camp, there always had only 2 thoughts occupy my mind all the time. One is, how can I survive another day? Another one is, how can I achieve my quota today? And sometimes we were forced to work overnight so that our products could catch the plane for the overseas countries. And the police were very proud that all our products were exported to Western countries. So you must ensure the high quality because they are for exportation. So that's why we say so many made in China products so cheap, because they cost 0 for their labor. So none of the American companies can compete with that. Even after I used toilet, I dare not to wash my hand, because if I wash my hand, however I try to dry it, it's still damp. With a damp hand, I couldn't knit the sweaters as fast as I could. So, and there are so many times that 1 more minute of sleep was better than all the gold in the world for us. So many of those made in China cheap products were actually made by prisoners like me with blood and tears in the camps. So next time when we say made in China products, try to remember what we say today. I think there's one slide of people make those electronic products using in these computers or that. Yes, I made some investigations. 1 little pound, I think, another one that we have shown some forward. The labor camp didn't pay anything to the prisoners who made them, but those kind of things, only 1 pound were sold maybe for over $100. And the quota for the people to finish was more than 10 kilos per day without receiving anything. So I did some calculation, so their profit margin is like maybe 5,000 or 50,000 of, if you calculate the retail price against the labor cost. So no real company can compete with that kind of hard, cheap labor. So, and this is very wide, existing in all the jail prisons, detention centers, and labor camps. So, and I think in China there were maybe thousands of labor camps in China, and overall there could be 1 million people in the labor camp. And oh yes, this is this one. They are making some of the dildos, so that was very widely used.
We also talked about on the radio show that you have this 5,000 years of Chinese culture. One of the leading civilizations throughout this time has been in China. But on top of that, it overlaid this ideology of communism, Marxism, socialism, which is not Chinese.
Yes, we talk about this in the radio show. There were actually the China we knew about we were talking about 5,000 years of brilliant Chinese history, of brilliant Chinese people that exist before the Communist Party took over. So after the Chinese Communist Party took over China, it's no longer the China we once knew. So for me, this party, this Marxism ideology came from Germany. It's an alien thing. So this is an alien entity or specter taking hostage of this nation, of this China. So now I don't think we can no longer call it a Chinese nation or Chinese culture. It's the Communist Party culture, a Communist Party nation. So we, as a real Chinese people, we hope to take back our own culture and our own history and our own, nation. So right now, I know there is a performing arts group called Shen Yun Performing Arts. It's performing, I think, all over the world, including here in California. If you have gone to watch the show, you can see what the real Chinese culture was, how beautiful it was, how human, how brilliant, what kind of beauty and civilization we once had. That's the real China we want to reclaim after the Communist Party goes away.
Hello. I was wondering so much. Did you have to give your daughter up, or how is she doing today?
Yes, when I escaped, I had to leave her behind. But lucky enough, like I said, I was granted refugee status. So as soon as I had that, I applied for her to join me. So exactly 3 years after I was released from the camp, she was able to join me in Sydney. So yeah, that was a very, very happy, experience for me. So that she could, when she was first in Australia, she was still brainwashed by the Communist Party when some of my fellow Falun Gong practitioners tried to tell her that Falun Gong practitioners are good and Falun Gong is good to the health. She said, no, I don't believe it. She didn't want to talk about it, but somehow I didn't try to convince her. But to my surprise, one day she was reading something from the internet herself. She was 12 years old then. And she suddenly said, I feel so bad. I asked why. She said, I feel I was cheated. So somehow from the internet, I didn't say anything to her. She found out the truth for herself. She found out she was cheated. And then she asked me to publish a declaration, a solemn declaration for her on behalf, because she told me she was forced to, she was the editor. Every class have the board on their classroom, so they edited some kind of articles on that board. So she was an editor, she wrote up something bad against Falun Gong. So she felt guilty now, and she asked me to publish a solemn declaration to denounce what she was cheated into doing, and to denounce she was joined the young pioneers. That was every child in China was forced to join that young pioneers. You have a red scarf. You are actually the reserve team for the Communist Party. So she denounced her young pioneer membership at her own free will. So that was the most heartening part. Without me trying to convince her, she realized she was deceived. She chose to stand with the truth, with freedom. So she grown up in Sydney. She's still in Sydney University studying today. So that's very good.
The rest of your family in China has not been so lucky. How has the regime retaliated against them for your work?
Yes, my other family suffered a lot. Ever since I escaped, I was never allowed to go back to China. So when my father was dying back in 2014, I wasn't able to go back to say the last word for him. So I saw him the last time before I escaped. Never saw him again. So he already passed away miserably in 2014. And my mother, when she was on her way here to visit me in 2018, she was stopped at the customer, and the authority told her her passport was revoked, and they didn't tell her the reason, but of course she knew it was because I was, exposing their evil all the time. So they persecute my family, and my two sisters were also persecuted. One were also thrown into the labor camp and detained for 18 months. And another one, she's not a Falun Gong practitioner, but she was demoted from her work. Her salary was reduced for a few thousand yuan per month. So she also suffered just because she is my sister. So, and regularly the National Security will be having a talk with my mom. They are still giving her pressure and ask her to give me pressure for me to stop talking. So for the past over 20 years, this has been always happening. Our phone is always tapped. I actually had to stop talking to my sister because I didn't want to get her, into more trouble. So that's the price many overseas dissident Chinese people had to pay. We never get to see our family, even if they were dying. So they use the passport, the visas, as another powerful tool, not only to control Chinese people, but Americans as well. I know many China scholars American China scholars because they want to go inside China to do film study. They need a visa to China. So they dare not to really upset the party because they don't want to lose their visa. So when they do their so-called China study, they actually practice self-censorship. They know the bottom line. Maybe you can talk a little bit of cultural revolution, maybe a little of democracy, but never talk about Falun Gong, never talk about organ harvesting. So they know the bottom line. So they use this kind of thing as a tool, not only to intimidate and persecute overseas Chinese people, but also Western scholars and businessmen who want to go into China.
Do you think Solzhenitsyn was right that what you experienced, what he experienced, that coercion is essential and inevitable in any socialist, Marxist, communist system?
Yes, I think this because communism, I think, in nature is against humanity. So without coercion, it would never get to anywhere because it is totally against human nature, human, instinct, or what we were created. When we were created as human, we have our nature, like kindness, but they instill hatred. The very essential, I think, elements for the party culture is hatred. We have to, so like Chinese people say, in the morning we have to hate the Americans, in the noon we hate Japan, in the night we have to hate Taiwanese, and if we have a little bit time at tea time, we hate a little bit of South Korea. So they use hate to instill inside people's mind to drive them against those. But I think every human being have a kindness in their heart. So if you have kindness in your heart, it's very hard for you to survive in the party system. Like people ask me, how could those policemen do such evil to a fellow human being? Because they have not only this philosophy of hate. If it's glorious to hate your enemy, because if Falun Gong is the enemy, it's all right to hate them, to kill them, to torture them because they're enemy. If Americans are enemy, it's okay and it's glorious if we kill our enemy. And also they have practical method in place. If you do a good job, you are given more money. If you failed to reach the quota of reforming Falun Gong practitioners, you lose your job. And the police gave the pressure to those real criminals in the camp. If they torture Falun Gong practitioners into signing the paper, they could be released ahead of time. If they couldn't achieve the quota, they were also not allowed to sleep. So they turned against Falun Gong because they dare not to hate or fight against the police. So the only target is us because we are powerless in the camp. And if any police officer, if he signs my release paper, and he is held responsible for whatever I do within 3 years. Say, within 3 years, if I was caught doing Falun Gong again, he would lose his job or lose a huge amount of money. So they'd rather torture me to death. If they torture me to death, they will not be held responsibility or drive me into insanity rather than release me with the hope of going back to Falun Gong again. So they have this whole system to maintain, to ensure that you do evil. You became part of the evil machine to do evil for them. Otherwise, you can't survive in this society. I heard one story of a Falun Gong practitioner who was arrested, and he refused to sign the statement to give up Falun Gong. Okay, then they bring 20-some of his relatives, his family, all to the police station, and everybody knelt down begging him, if you don't sign this paper, all of us will lose our job. And he could face all the torture. He'd rather die for his belief, but he couldn't face 20 over of his relatives all losing the job. So he signed the paper. So that's to the extent why they could do so much evil, because they have this ideology of hatred and they have this social system to ensure that you do evil. The more evil you are, the better off you are.
Just as in the radio show, we could go on and we could talk to you for another hour and probably only just begin to get into your experience and what's going on in China. We can't thank you enough for coming out.
Thank
Telling
you.
your stories.
Thank you.
Here, you know, if for speaking out, maybe you might lose your job. At a company, if it's a liberal company, you might lose your job. Very few, none of us have had to put what we believe on the line the way you did. And you have our admiration for what you have done, what you went through, and what you're trying to do now. Thank you for coming.